This is Derek, and my guest today is a very famous face and famous voice. Billy Kay has come down from Broughty Ferry.
Not quite, Newport-on-Tay.
Oh, that's posher, I think.
Dundee's left bank, as Graham Ogilvy called it in one of his books.
And you're here this time, Bill. We've spoken to you a few times before, but you're kind of reviving the series that you did for the BBC on the cause of national independence for Radio Scotland, but presumably now updated since we've had the Great Defeat.
Yes, the first series was recorded in 2012, and the BBC commissioned it because they had to commission it because it was such a hot topic, but I knew that they wouldn't broadcast it anywhere near the actual referendum, so it went out in 2012, and fortunately, the only fortunate thing from the defeat in the referendum, from my perspective, is that they've commissioned a programme to bring it up to date from 2012 through to the present day.
And it tells the story from what point? I mean, where do you know, we were talking about independence of Scotland, I mean, which century, let alone which concept do you start with?
Well, it's mainly a history of modern nationalism, from the rise of modern nationalism and the growth of the SNP, which grew in the 1920s and early 1930s when people like Sir Compton Mackenzie and Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham and Hugh McDermott and people like that started the National Party and then eventually the Scottish National Party. So that is the main focus of about three and a half of the programmes. But because it was a series on the history of nationalism, I decided to begin at the beginning. And because I had never seen, in all my history of watching and listening as a Scot, I'd never seen anything that celebrated, for example, the victory at Bannockburn. So I was determined to begin there. And the way I tied it in was, I had Alan McInnes and Richard Finlay of Strathclyde University, after a statement from Barbers Bruce about we hae the recht and for the recht ilk man should fecht, which goes back to the beginning of the Scottish nation and the victory at Bannockburn. I had those historians saying that perhaps Scottish cultural identity and cultural nationalism is perhaps more alive now, 700 years later, than it's ever been before in the intervening years. So that tied the present and the past.
Is it still relevant though? As soon as you say Bannockburn, there'll be a lot of Scots who listen and say, well, wait a minute, look, you know, that is how many hundreds of years ago. The whole world has changed, Scotland's changed, and it sounds like a kind of throwback to them, an irrelevance and an historical interest, but politically an irrelevance.
Yes, and that was my eldest daughter's first reaction. Why have you got Bannockburn in there? Because she would consider also a modern nationalist. Why was it there? It was that desire for once in my life to hear someone expressing strong feelings about the origins of the nation, of how this disparate people, the early documents referring to the Scots and the boroughs refer to Scottis et Anglis, Franquis et Flemingis, the Scots, the French, the Flemish, the English who inhabited the boroughs, who forged themselves into this amazingly diverse, multilingual, multicultural society that resisted one of the superpowers of Europe because of the sense of common weal that they had. And I just think that is a phenomenal thing to celebrate. And because I'd never heard it before on the media, I wanted to start there with that celebration and then take it from there and pick up the strands from the early days that manifest themselves in modern nationalism.
I was going to say, you could make the same case of a kind of a multinational community, which Scotland nowadays is, and whether it's taking on a superpower, but certainly, you know, England as a major force and the UK as a major political force. I mean, are there echoes there? Is there a similarity? Because at Bannockburn we just think of, you know, Scots killing Englishmen.
Well, it's that fact of the diverse and what Willie McIlvanney calls the mongrel nature of Scottish society, that it valued diversity at a time when ethnic identity was the important thing. And I think that's been an important strand in Scottish nationalism throughout its history. It's never been an ethnic identity. It's because of those reasons. It's been a civic identity. And again, that's something to pride ourselves on. So that during the recent referendum campaign, there were Poles for independence, English for independence, Americans for independence. There were loads of disparate groups, LGBT for independence. I remember speaking to people at their stall in Calton Hill. It was a remarkably diverse group of people who all identify and think that the way to improve our society is to have an independent Scotland. And I think that has been part of the experience from very early, and it's manifested itself throughout Scottish history.
And Scots too fought for the English at Agincourt. We had Scots on the boats at Trafalgar when Nelson won. And I've just been reading, because this is the anniversary year of Waterloo. Scots regiments, of course, fought at Waterloo as well. So there is this kind of constant interchange and transfer of identity and nationality.
There is, although you could say that the soldiers at Waterloo were paid to be there. And you can make the same case for the Scottish soldiers of fortune across Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries. Interestingly, one of the figures that I've approached in one of my historic series about the Scots abroad was in France, a celebration of the Old Alliance. One of Napoleon's generals was Le Maréchal MacDonald, and I've been at La Maison de Naissance du Maréchal MacDonald, the birthplace of Marshal MacDonald in Sancerre. They always chose good wine areas to settle in. And the guide in the house told me, when I pointed out that MacDonald had not fought at Waterloo but fought in other great battles, he said, well, the joke was that Napoleon didn't put him in against the British at Waterloo because if he heard the sound of the pipes, he wouldn't know which side he was on. That came from the guide in the Maison de Naissance du Maréchal MacDonald. And his people were Jacobites who went to France, as a lot of Jacobite exiles did during the 18th century.
Coming back to the series, the cause, I mean, where are we now? What's your, I mean, having obviously spoken to people since the referendum, do you reach a conclusion, or what sense did you get from it? Is it just bitter disappointment, or? No,
I call the programme Resurrection, because it felt for most people like a death, but literally within 24 hours. In the case of Nicola Sturgeon, whom I interviewed, it was within 24 hours she realised that the game was still on, because she describes her husband Peter saying, Nicola, there's just been 500 people signed in up for the SNP in so many minutes. And that went on that whole weekend after the referendum. And this got her going and energised again. And even when Alec resigned and the pain and the tears of that, she felt within a few days that the fight would go on. La luta continua.
I mean, why is that, do you think, though? Because, I mean, the feeling of, devastation, desolation afterwards was profound. I mean, my own feeling was that I immediately saw, well, if we're not going to get independence, what we need is home rule, a version of that within the UK, and make that as strong as possible. So, but I moved on to a different tier of campaigning, as it were. But why do you think that those people signing up for the SNP were doing so because of the desire for independence?
Yes, I do. And it was a reaction to the pain of the defeat. One of the historians on the programme, Lynch,
Peter
I
Lynch.
always get mixed up with Peter and Jim. Jim is the father who edits the Scots Independent. I've got a good story about him. Peter is the son, who's a historian at Stirling University. And he tells of a friend of his, whom he says never joined a thing in his life, seeing Cameron on the steps the following morning and being so outraged by that, he went to his computer and immediately joined the SNP. And like that, thousands. People that I know in Newport-on-Tay, who are part of a wine group, tasting group I've belonged to for years. People that I never even realised were political come up to me. 2 people and that I know come up and said they'd joined the SNP within a week or two of that happening. So that was
a wine club insurgency.
That, yes, yes. As Kevin McKenna describes them, champagne socialists and nationalists, claret nationalists.
So, I mean, where are we now then, according to the interviews that you've done? I mean, what's your deduction about where we are?
I think that, well, one of the things Jim Lynch says, and one of the things they all say, is no matter the pain of it, they would do it all again. And that's remarkable people that I interviewed. One, for example, Harry Marshall, who suffered from the pain of being in Iraq and channeled all his energies from recovering from that into the Yes campaign. And he personally recruited something like 3,300 people, signed them up to register to vote. People like that, and people in Dundee who just spent months and months of their time and were so devastated by it, but would immediately get back and concentrate their energies once again on the same cause, the same subject. And all of them, and this is where Jim Lynch has a good story. Jim Lynch is now 80 years old, the editor of the Scots Independent. And he says in the programme that he had a deal with his doctor to keep him alive for the independence referendum. But now he's asking for an extension so that he'll be alive when Scotland gets independence. And everyone from Nicola Sturgeon to the activists in Dundee are convinced that it is just a matter of time before they get independence.
This kind of refuses to be beaten in a way, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Is it not a little bit like, Wallace eventually was executed, and at one level you can say, well, he was defeated, but actually what he did was galvanise a nation and led to the creation of an independent Scotland.
That's right. It will not go away, and because it is so wide, it's now not a national party, it's a national movement. People like Jean Freeman of Women for Independence, Business for Independence, people from quite diverse political backgrounds, Radical Independence Campaign, Commonweal, they all realise that that is the way forward. And I think the tragic stories coming out of the House of Lords in Westminster just add to all of that. One of the people interviewed was Chris Law, who won the Dundee seat, and who was responsible for the wonderful fire engine, Spirit of Independence, during the campaign. And he says things like, he was so horrified by Better Together supporters phoning up old age pensioners and telling them that they would lose their pension if they voted yes. That he was so horrified by that he's got this burning energy to only be in Westminster for as long as it takes to get Scottish independence. And I think a lot of the new wave of people who joined the SNP are like that.
But that's not what went wrong in the referendum, though, is it? I mean, that people were conned, and undoubtedly it's a political campaign. All sorts of things will be said, and you'll be manipulated one way or another. Yes. But surely it remains the case, does it not, that there is still a majority, a lot of them are what I'd call a silent majority, who simply are not buying this idea of independence. And I mean, it will require a generational change, because we know young people are more interested, but in other words, it needs the passing of a generation to get there.
Maybe not as much. If you mean by a generation 20 years, I don't think it'll be as long as that. I think it'll really be the generation over 70 may not be there in 10 years' time. And most of them voted no. And I honestly think that it's even under 60, you possibly had a majority. Certainly under 50, 40. So the momentum is still there for the change that we want. And I don't think it'll go away, and I think it'll be added to all the time. But I hear you, I think there are people. And the programme confronts the shame that some people on the yes side felt, that their country had done that they had done that to themselves. And it left them with grave question marks until the surge, if you like, about their identity as Scots. It was that profound. How do you vote against the independence of your country? But contrasting that with the energy and enthusiasm of the Yes campaign, but then the resurrection and the rebirth after the referendum. And that's where we are just now. I mean, who would have ever dreamed, as Nicola Sturgeon says, when she joined the SNP, the thought of her being within 10% of winning a yes vote and then of winning 56 out of 59 MPs would just have been regarded as fantasy. But that's where that's where she is now. So there's a lot to play for.
Well, finally, just pitch your programming as a listen. You know, obviously you've got to be interested in politics, but it's a series, so it's a long listen, if you like. I mean, why should my viewers here listen to The Cause? They'll be astonished by how dramatically things have turned round. The SNP was regarded, as Tom Nairn says, as a bit of a cult, a bit like Trotskyists, as late as the early 1960s. I've got Professor Neil McCormick's wife, Flora, saying when they put up SNP stickers in Edinburgh, neighbours say to them, "You're SNP, but you're such nice people." Jimmy Halliday saying that he never met another nationalist until he was about 18 years old, of having the first SNP gathering and they could all be on the front step of a country house hotel in Stirling. They've gone from that to the present day. And it's a phenomenal story. And there's a strong cultural element because it brings in the folk revival. It brings in the Corries writing Fleur of Scotland in the 1960s. It brings in Hamish Henderson singing The Freedom Come All Ye. It brings in Hugh MacDiarmid, a Scottish poet, maun assume the burden of his people's doom and dee to brack their living tomb. Brilliant stuff. But also, I mean, it's maybe worth mentioning in passing, I mean, if you think 20, 25 years ago when I was reporting politics, it was quite difficult for people who held professional jobs to go public and say they were nationalists, and a lot of people didn't do that in order to save their career. But people like Swinney, Fiona Hislop, Alex Salmond himself, working in financial services, you know, respectable, what were then respectable places like banks and financial institutions, maybe not today. But they were prepared to risk their own personal advancement by saying, no, I am a nationalist and I'm in the SNP and I'm an office bearer and I'm standing for election. I believe in this.
Yeah, they were pioneers, these people. And even since the original series was made, the original 5, 1 or 2 people like Jimmy Halliday and Neil McCormick have died. And we owe them a lot for keeping the flame alive during these years when it was regarded as disloyal and anti-British to be a Scottish nationalist, to the extent that I remember Gordon Casely, the journalist from Aberdeenshire, telling me that his father, who was in the police from memory, being told that his boy had joined the SNP and to keep an eye on him. As late as the 1980s, a distinguished professor at an ancient university who's a friend of mine described about 5 raids by the special branch on his flat, and in one of them the police told him, he had a big St Andrew's cross up on his wall, the police told him to take that rag off the wall. This is in the 1980s. This is how recently the British state attempted to suppress the growing demand for democratic renewal that was in the hearts of most Scots.
Okay, Billy. Thanks very much.
Thank you.